Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. My apologies if you logged in on Thursday. Unfortunately, we had a few issues that were beyond our control. I was caught up with a number of different things, so I wasn't able to be here in person, to be on online. I am, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Julie Williams. I'm a registered migration agent, and I have been for 24 years now. I am going to be talking through today various different updates in regards to the announcements from Saturday of pathway to permanent residency, as well as other skilled options and what's going on with the independent state nominated and independent pathways as well. What I won't be doing today is sharing checklists, assessing your individual eligibility, or discussing about other visa types other than skilled migration today, or answering people's questions about applications that individuals have lodged themselves. But I will hopefully be covering everything else in regards to updates, the employer-sponsored, the skilled migration, and what's just happening, so you've got a bit more transparency on what this looks like over the next few months. Okay, so the agenda today will be, as I mentioned, the updates that occurred from this Saturday, the 25th of November, for a pathway to permanent residency. I'll also be talking about how do you migrate without an employer sponsor, and how does the reduced state and territory nominated visa program impact skilled migrants, and also how do employer-sponsored pathways compare to, say, the skilled nominated or state-sponsored. And then I'll be having a Q&A. So I won't be answering questions as we go through, because there might be certain questions that you think of that I'll end up answering throughout the course. So if you can just keep that through to the end, that would be fantastic if I haven't answered your question. Okay. And sorry, it's not in the chat box, it's a Q&A that you would be putting, I believe that's enabled, your questions on there. So what's happened from the 25th of November? The end of COVID concessions occurred. Look, that's not going to be a really big surprise to anybody. These COVID concessions came in early 2020. They were introduced by the former government, and there was actually no end date in the legislation. So the current government has put an end date to that, and they ceased on the afternoon of Saturday. For the majority of you, this is not really going to affect you. It was just removing concessions which allowed certain visa classes to apply whilst onshore, when usually they required it to be offshore, or vice versa, had to be offshore and people were onshore and usually couldn't lodge it. So that's really the only changes to the COVID concession. So for most of you, it's not really going to affect you. But what everybody is waiting for, and the long-awaited announcement, and I guess an early Christmas present for many of you, is expanding access to the temporary residency transition stream of the subclass 186 and 187 for all holders of a subclass 482 and some that still hold the subclass 457 visa. And that's regardless of the stream in which you held your visa. So in other words, anybody that's currently a 482 or a 457 visa holder were up until the 25th of November prevented from lodging a permanent residency subclass 186 application through the temporary transition stream, because their occupation was either on the short-term skilled occupation list or the regional occupation list. You can now pathway into permanent residency as long as you meet all the criteria for the permanent residency. So there is no changes for those people in occupations on the medium to long-term strategic skills list. It's only for those that couldn't previously apply. It also means you cannot lodge a direct entry. So unlike some occupations where you can have a skills assessment, show 3 years relevant work experience, you can then actually submit an application prior to meeting the requirements for a temporary transition stream. But that is not available for the subclass 482 short-term occupation list, because whilst there has been a pathway, nothing else has changed in regard to the skilled occupation list. The other good news is for everybody, either on the short-term or the medium long-term strategic skills list, the reduction of having to wait for eligibility for when you can apply for permanent residency. So previously it was if you had worked for the one employer whilst the holder of a 482 or 457 visa for 3 out of the last 4 years, you could then transition through to permanent residency. That's been reduced to 2 years. So if you've worked for 2 out of the last 3 years, so for example, maybe you've had a break, in that period, you've had some unpaid leave, whatever it may be, but you've still continuously worked for that one employer for 2 out of the 3 years, then you will be eligible as of now to apply, as long as you meet all the other criteria for the 186 permanent residency. You've still got to meet the requirements for permanent residency. Doesn't automatically mean that you're eligible for the grant of the visa, but it certainly means you're eligible for the lodgement of the visa. This removal of the requirement for occupation to be identified in the nomination to be on the medium long-term list or the regional occupation list, this means that occupations that perhaps are removed over time off the occupation list, it just means that there is no one's going to be disadvantaged by this new ability to be able to apply for permanent residency. It also extends the permission to allow all employers to nominate and lodge a nomination under the 186 temporary residency stream, who are sponsored currently under a labour agreement. That's really good news for many, because a lot of people that are on a labour agreement do usually have to apply through the labour agreement or some other means to be able to access permanent residency through the subclass 186. It also, with changes that come into effect from the 25th of November, it removes the limit on the number of times you can be onshore to apply for a 482 visa application. So previously, if your occupation is on the short-term stream, up until COVID concessions, it meant that you could only apply for a maximum 2 482s whilst here in Australia, which would give you a maximum 4-year stay. However, they removed that during the COVID concession period. Then they reintroduced it from the 1st of July this year, and now they've taken it back again. So it's good news for those people that have lodged more than 2 onshore 482 applications, where they're considering permanent residency, but they haven't worked for 2 out of the 3 years for some reason or another for the same employer. You can lodge another onshore 482. So that's really good news for a number of people. So applying for the permanent residency, there is still criteria that needs to be met. So whilst it doesn't have to be an occupation on the medium long-term strategic skilled list, this new pathway to permanent residency for occupations in the short-term list, you have to be a current TSS or 482 visa holder to access this. You can't be on a graduate visa and have worked for the same employer for 2 years. You can't be on a working holiday visa and have worked for the employer for 2 years because of COVID concessions. You're able to work beyond the 6 months. You must be the holder of a TSS or 482 visa to access this pathway to permanent residency through the subclass 186 temporary residency transition stream. You do require the 2 years full-time experience, as I mentioned, and it must be with the same employer. Doesn't necessarily have to be consecutive. Maybe you've had a break in those 2 years. As long as it's 2 years in total, in the last 3 years immediately preceding the application. There are no changes to the age requirements, so you still must be under 45 years of age unless there are exemptions. Those exemptions are that you have worked for the same employer for 2 years but are earning the high income salary threshold, which is currently, if I remember off the top of my head, around 165,000 or thereabouts per annum. And that increases each year. Or if you're a general practitioner, doctor working in a regional area, or you are one of the long-term concessions from the 457 change, you'll be able to access the age restriction on there. But otherwise, there's no changes to the age restriction with these new announcements on the pathway to permanent residency for TSS holders. Okay, I'm going to move on now, and because there really is no other changes that has been announced to for the 25th of November, whilst the Minister has made announcements saying that there will be a raft of new changes. They are going to be slowly introduced as they work through the legislation for each point that they're going to be considering. So I don't foresee any further changes to this program until possibly March at the earliest next year. But we will continue, as always, to keep you updated if we do hear of any changes that may be occurring. So the overview of the general skill migration, I often get inquiries from employers who are employing people on a temporary visa. It might be a working holiday visa, it might be a student visa, it might be a graduate 485 visa, and they're wanting to keep them on, but that individual doesn't necessarily meet the requirements of the 482, or perhaps the employer doesn't want to go down the pathway of a subclass 482, or they don't want to go through the pathway necessarily of permanent residency. There is other options, but again, the individual must be eligible. And the general skill migration, I'm going to be talking to you about the likelihood of getting an invitation, because the general skilled migration, whilst it's independent of an employer sponsoring, it does require the federal government to send an invitation. It also has to require, if you're applying for a subclass 190 through a state or territory, require an invitation from that state or territory. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview on the GSM program. The subclass 189 is an independent. These programs are all points-based. So the higher the points you obtain, the more likelihood is of getting an invitation through the skilled migration program. So the 189 is completely independent of any state or territory nomination, and it's points-based, as I mentioned. You have to have a minimum of 65 points to lodge an expression of interest. And you have to have completed a skills assessment and done an English language test before you lodge an expression of interest. You get points for your qualifications, you get points for your work experience, and it's very much focused on work experience, because whilst you may have a qualification such as a degree qualification or some form of tertiary qualification for your skilled occupation, if you don't have the work experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are skilled. This program's for highly skilled, and Australia are wanting to attract those that have got employment in this area. And the 189 visa program, they haven't actually invited anybody since May of this year. And with the announcement of now the pathway of residency for virtually all 482 visa holders, if they meet the criteria and eligibility for permanent residency, that's going to increase the number of spaces or number of places that the government have allocated for this program year to the skilled migration program. So a program year is our financial year here in Australia. So it's from the 1st of July to the end of June each year. And that program year, they set about in the budget each May of each year to say how many, what's the number of skilled migrants they're going to be providing a visa for here in Australia. So whilst they have increased the opportunity for a number of people to apply, they haven't increased the number of spaces allocated to the skilled migration program. Therefore, my take on that is that it's unlikely the 189 is really going to be activated in a big way for the remainder of this program year, bearing in mind there's really only 7 months left of this program year, and they haven't made any invitations yet. I would suggest that those allocations are going to go in the employer-sponsored program and also the state and territory nominated program. The reason for that is, again, the key is all about employability. And if you're already employed in your skilled occupation, then you're more likely to assimilate and be able to contribute to the economy in Australia than if you didn't already work in that position. The same with the state subclass 190, subclass 491, provisional, skilled work, regional. These are state nominated, and again, each state and territory has to issue an invitation. They have, each of them have all their own rules and criteria, dependent on the type of occupation or the sector that they're trying to attract and meet the shortages in their particular state and territory. Again, the numbers, as you'll see when I go through the slides, have reduced dramatically. So the states and territories are really targeting those specific sectors where they feel there is a real shortage in their area. So when you apply for state or territory nominated, it requires 4 steps. It requires satisfying the points test. As I mentioned, you need a minimum of 65 points. You must lodge an expression of interest, which is not a visa application. It's just an expression of interest. That stays there for 2 years. If you don't get selected, it then just disappears after 2 years. You have to keep that updated. You need to make certain that things don't expire, like the skills assessment, the your English language. And each state and territory has a different process in which they nominate and select people. Some states like Victoria, for example, have an additional step of a registration of interest. And again, each state and territory have their own target lists of the type of occupations they're looking to attract. I do get a lot of people saying, well, hang on, it says or the entire occupation list, and as long as your occupation is on that list. Yeah, absolutely. As long as your occupation is on that list, but it doesn't mean, whilst your occupation might be on the general list, it's not necessarily the target sector that state and territory are looking and focused for. For example, the majority of states and territories at the moment are targeting education and health professionals. So if you're in those areas, you'll get an invitation quite quickly. And then once you do get an invitation from the state and territory, you've met all the requirements and they've approved that, you'll then get an invitation from the Commonwealth Government to then lodge your visa application. So there's quite a few steps, and sometimes it's a lot more difficult than employer-sponsored, because unlike employer-sponsored, especially the subclass 482, you don't require a skills assessment for the majority of occupations. There's only 1 or 2 very sort of rare circumstances that you do need a skills assessment for the 482. You don't need a skills assessment for the 186 if it's through the temporary transition, residency transition stream, which is the TRT stream that we've been referring to, that now everyone can apply for if they've worked for the same employer for 2 years. You don't need a skills assessment for that. So when employers or individuals are looking at other options and they're looking at the 189 or the 190 or the 491, if you don't meet the requirements for a skills assessment, then you're not going to get across first base. And that usually requires a minimum of tertiary qualification for a skills assessment and also relevant work experience. In some circumstances, relevant work experience will be considered in lieu of a tertiary qualification, but it means you need even more work experience. And so then that limits people's chances of being able to meet the requirements for that. So just going through the different types of, or the major ones for general skill migration is the 189. It's a permanent visa. Once granted, you don't need sponsorship of any kind. You don't need to work in regional Australia. And the occupation list, as long as it's on the medium and long-term strategic skills list. For the purposes of 189, I might add, because there's a couple of occupations that are on the medium long-term strategic skills list for 186, employer sponsored, but not necessarily 189. Then there's the subclass 190 that is also permanent, and you must have the approval of the state or territory. The approval of state or territory on most cases require you to be living and in some cases working in that state before they'll even consider you. You can't be living, for example, in New South Wales and wanting to be sponsored by South Australia because you see that your occupation is currently being sponsored by South Australia. They won't consider you if you're not living in that state. And more often than not, those states and territories will require a minimum residential period to be eligible for that. And each state and territory have strategically targeted occupations and industry sectors. So whilst it may say on the website that you can apply as long as your occupation is an occupation on the skilled occupation list, it may not necessarily attract a nomination from that state or territory. So you need to look very carefully into that. The 491 skilled program is for those occupations in regional areas. In other words, if you are living and working in a regional area outside of either Brisbane, Sydney or Melbourne, you may be able to access a broader range of occupations. And that's the only advantage of that. And that will provide you with a 5-year visa, access to Medicare, and it is like applying for the permanent residency in a way. And then as long as you meet the criteria after a certain set period of time, you can apply for permanent residency. Okay, so just looking to a lot of people were taking advantage in the last 12 months of the state territory nominations because they had very generous allocations and they had a wide variety of occupations. The state and territories were all taken back by a real surprise by the announcement of the federal government. Their allocations for this program year have been significantly reduced. If you look at the table that's on the screen at the moment, you will see the reduction of the numbers, and it's huge. Look at New South Wales, down by 6,500. So, this time last year, where you looked quite, confident in getting an invitation, it's going to be very difficult because there's only 2,650 spaces for the 190 state nomination for New South Wales. Again, Victoria down, by 10,000, just over 10,000. It's huge. So there are a huge reduction, and that's where I think the government are leaning more on the employer-sponsored. And I mean, there may be a few reasons for the, sorry, I've just covered my camera there. The state and territory nominations have decreased, even though there's skill shortages still going on across Australia. It's probably because of changes to the administration are being considered as far as the skilled migration program. And a part of the migration strategy outline, the government has identified a need to reform the points test to ensure it focuses on factors that maximises Australia's productivity and addresses also the ageing population challenges. So that could be part of the reason. And also, I think they're trying to reshape the points test to emphasise younger migrants with great earning potential. So as well as reforming, they're also reforming a lot of the business innovation investment programs. Some of you on this here today, that might not be relevant, but that used to be people probably a lot older that didn't necessarily also contribute to the economy, etc. And also another reason could be the government's focus on returning to pre-pandemic levels of the population growth as well. So net overseas migration, which refers to the net gain or loss of population through international migration to and from Australia, has become a continuous topic in the media. And this also may have influenced the government to reduce the size of the state and territory program for this year. But it is disappointing for many, especially for overseas candidates who don't have that ability to find an employer to be able to sponsor. So there is a real focus on employer-sponsored at the moment. With so I guess if those people here in Australia, if you do have an opportunity for an employer to sponsor you, that's really going to be the way to go. Sorry, I think. And then employer-sponsored visas compare. How do they compare? Well, depends now whether you meet the criteria for 186. The 186 direct entry hasn't changed. So whilst the pathway to permanent residency has changed for 482 holders, where they don't have to have 3 years experience, they only need 2 years with the same employer. What hasn't changed is the direct entry pathway. It still requires, if you're not the holder of the 482 or you haven't worked for the employer for 2 years, you do have to have a skills assessment and you do have to show 3 years full-time experience, because there is a couple of differences with the 186. Direct entry is a skills assessment plus 3 years experience full-time. Doesn't have to be with the same employer. Doesn't even have to be with an employer in Australia. Whereas the 186 temporary transition stream, that is for those occupations that are already on, somebody already on the 482 visa that needs that 2 years. So just because you've got 2 years employment doesn't mean it's going to necessarily bypass that 482 if you can't meet, if you don't have the 3 years and can't meet the skills assessment. Processing priorities for those applying for skilled visas. There's the health and education professionals, as I mentioned before. That is also for the 186. This is a ministerial direction, and the ministerial direction is directing the case officers how they need to prioritise their applications in the skilled migration program. So health and education professionals need first and foremost. That's for 186 and also for the 190 program. Employer-sponsored visas for accredited sponsors. So if your employer is an accredited sponsor, and they'll know if they are, they also gain priority processing, which is done pretty quickly, really, in a matter of days, couple of weeks. It's very quick. Offshore skilled migrants, that's the same with the 192 health and educational professionals. You'll get it. If you've got a decision-ready application, you'll see your visa granted within a matter of weeks, if not days. And then they looking at offshore skilled migrants to boost the numbers here in Australia, and then regional migration. If you do have anything that you want to ask individually, don't feel free to reach out. We will continue to have future webinars. We do on a regular basis, depending on changes to the different visas. You can subscribe to our newsletters. You can always book a consultation, and our contact details are there on the screen for you.